Hey guys, Bugcat7 here. Okay, it is Tuesday, October 23rd, 2018, and I want to thank you for visiting the Stonewall Research channel here on YouTube. Thank you very much. And I want to welcome all my new subscribers. Really appreciate your subscriptions here. Please do go through my material here on the channel. It's some excellent research. I'm sure it won't disappoint you, and I would appreciate anybody who's watching my videos. Please do hit the like, guys, because without the likes, it's difficult for people to search for this subject matter in the searches, because it's not going to come at the top of the searches. So please do hit the like button, okay? All right, guys. So today we're going to get a little bit into the weeds here. I continue to read in this book, The First American by C.W. Ceram. And again, it's a book on sort of alternative research, amateur archaeology from the past. And it's stories that you won't hear in the mainstream or anything like that. So what would a book like this be if, we didn't get into the sort of wild speculation? There was a lot of that going on back at the time, and there is now. I mean, currently there's a lot of videos going on YouTube about Atlantis, its location, and these are recurring things in many of the channels that I subscribe to. So I mean, it's a fascinating subject. So Ceram too, back in the late 60s, 1970, we also, had to go through this stuff. I mean, it really had to, because of what he was, looking at in this book and telling us about. So we're going to look at some of that stuff in here, and he has a chapter here called, Chapter 15, it's called Wild Theories from Atlantis to Mu. Okay, and I'm just going to read some of that to you, and we're going to read some other stuff a little bit later on too that's related. But let me read to you this, because we want to get Ceram's take on this. And I think with this you have to read between the lines with Ceram, because even though it seems like he's not really promoting these ideas or anything, but in a way, I think in order to get his book published here, he couldn't be full on board with this stuff. He's trying to think. I think he's trying to remain sort of neutral, but if you read between the lines here, I don't think he's 100% on board with anything really. It just he's not for or against or whatever. So anyway, let me read to you this, and so this way, we'll cover it, and, this is part of, reviewing this book. So let me read to you some of the stuff from this chapter here, okay? Let me see here. A little picture of Atlantis there. Okay. All right, so let me read to you. This is from page 206. We're just going to read a few pages here. Okay, so Ceram continues on here. For many years, specialists have been divided over the question of possible contact between the Indian cultures in North and South America and civilizations on other continents. Those who argue that there were such contacts are defenders of the diffusion theory. But before we take up this question, we must mention two more fantastic stories concerning the origin of Indians, according to which all Indian culture is derived from extra-American sources. For like all wrong tracks, he says, such theories are part and parcel of the history of a science. They must be given their due. By contrast with their specious glitter, the light of science shines all the more brightly. So, Ceram is into the hardcore science and all that kind of stuff. But, he didn't live to see, all the new discoveries and new research. Göbekli Tepe, which you hardly hear anything about, which is rather curious to me. But, he had no idea of these things. Maybe if he was alive today, he might be more on the alternative side. He did do this book and he is mentioning this stuff. So I think that, again, you have to read between the lines. I think he really is giving it its due because he thinks it's a possibility. Okay, so he continues here. The question of Atlantis, for example, has provoked fierce controversy ever since antiquity. Along with serious efforts to substantiate the story, there have been the wildest theories which have sprung from pure imaginings. The concept of Atlantis goes back to two dialogues by the Greek philosopher Plato, the Timaeus and the Critias. According to these, Solon the lawgiver, who lived about 2 centuries before Plato, heard about Atlantis from Egyptian priests. It was described as a rich and powerful island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, inhabited by a highly civilized but warlike people. 9,000 years before his time, according to Solon, this land had vanished beneath the waves in a great natural catastrophe. As Plato tells the story, it is equally probable and improbable. Aristotle, who was Plato's pupil, called the account a fable without historical value. Still, there is no reason why there would not have been an island inhabited by a people as civilized as the time allowed that had been wiped out by a catastrophe. There have been examples of such, nor is it a folly to search for this land. You see that? Just an interesting note. There have been examples of such, nor is it a folly to search for this land. Heinrich Schliemann did something similar when he looked for the legendary Troy, and Arthur Evans when he searched for the equally legendary palace of Minos. They took their clues from ancient sources that scarcely seemed believable, but which were magnificently verified when these places came to light. They were discovered. So far, however, all searches for Atlantis have been in vain. In the course of time, it has been, quote-unquote, located in Spain, in the Canary Islands, at the mouth of the Niger River, in Mexico, and in Scandinavia. And in current times, in the middle of the Sahara, the eye of the Sahara, all these different things. Even today, it's still going on. In the 1950s, the German pastor Jürgen Spaneth claimed that he had found Atlantis and actually dived down to it. It lay submerged in the North Sea near the island of Helgoland. And as these lines are being written, James W. Maver Jr. is just as positive that Atlantis was situated near one of the Cyclades Islands in the Aegean Sea. There is no reason here's where Ceram sort of gives us a little clue as to what he's thinking. There is no reason to call off this search. Still, it has become somewhat ridiculous, for even if a sunken island with traces of a civilization were to be found, there would be no way of proving its identity with Plato's Atlantis. The data in the classical sources are simply too imprecise. But if a certain suggestion of fraudulence has clung to Atlantis research over the centuries, interesting, it is because of the myth-making that has gone along with it. The most fanciful forms of civilization have been attributed to Atlantis, and ultimately a fabulous tale has grown up of a prehistoric Atlantean culture towering over all others. Legend has in fact made the island the very source of all human cultures. Interesting statement. We cannot go into all the fantasies here. A brief example may suffice. It comes from a book by the anthroposophist Rudolf Steiner, whose creed still has followers all over the world, our Atlantean forefathers. Quote, just as today the power of heat is extracted from coal and transformed into kinetic energy in our vehicles, so the Atlanteans knew how to place the germinal powers of living organisms at the service of their technology. In Atlantean times, plants were not only raised as food, but also to utilize the forces slumbering within them for transportation and industry. Thus, the Atlanteans had devices which transformed the germinal force of seeds into technically exploitable power. Thus, the floating vehicles of the Atlanteans were propelled a short distance above the ground, unquote. Okay, that's a very interesting statement by Rudolf Steiner there. And today we have power plants, experimental power plants, that are being fueled by bacteria. So, I don't know, science fiction comes true. Okay, Ceram goes on. In addition to all that, we are asked to believe that the American cultures were, of course, of Atlantean origin. To the large groups of Rosicrucians, Theosophists, and Anthroposophists, this idea is gospel. It is strange, though, that the Indians remembered so very little of this civilization, which allegedly surpassed our own in technical perfection, and that they were not even able to preserve the wheel, let alone riding. I don't know what to think of that exactly. I've done some reading by other researchers, and, that may not necessarily be true. Just because it's not written down or whatever. These people had stories, fantastic stories that, I guess even Ceram doesn't take seriously. Nevertheless, he says, quote, two sages, Plato of Athens and Donnelly of Minneapolis, have made Atlantis a household world, unquote, wrote William Churchward in 1890. He was right. For 10 years previously, the book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly, whom he so blithely links with Plato, had gone into no less than 18 editions, and to this day is still read in America as an honored quote-unquote classic on the subject. Donnelly knew exactly where Atlantis was situated, more exactly than Plato. According to him, the drowned island lies in the Atlantic Ocean west of the Azores, and this is the location accepted by the majority of those who believe at all in Atlantis, which could be, this is my own personal opinion, could be related to the expanding Earth theory. Okay, and that's why Atlantis is not there. The Earth expanded and it sunk below the ocean. To look into expanding Earth, we'll talk about that later on. Nevertheless, the Atlantis theory is modesty itself compared with another theory born in our century. Its herald is Colonel James Churchward, not to be confused with the above name mentioned William, who in 1931 announced that he had rediscovered the land of Mu. In contrast to Atlantis, Mu lay in the Pacific Ocean and was, according to Churchward, much larger than Plato's island. It covered an area from Easter Island to the Carolines, from Hawaii in the north to the Cook Islands in the south. This continent, which given such a size it may well be called, had 64 million inhabitants. 50,000 years ago, a civilization had developed there that was, quote, in many respects superior to our own and far in advance of us in some important essentials which the modern world is just beginning to have cognizance of, unquote. The creation of man also took place in Mu. Quote, the oldest records of man are not to be found in Egypt or the valley of the Euphrates, but right here in North America and in the Orient where Mu planted her first colonies. Very interesting statement there. These assertions are based on a number of, quote, unquote, Nahal tablets, which Churchward, so he relates, found some 50 years before the publication of his book, quote, in certain monasteries in India and Tibet whose names are withheld by request, unquote. Unfortunately, Ceram says, period. According to Churchward, many years later, William Niven found corresponding stone tablets in Mexico. The Nahal tablets are supposed to be 15,000 years old. The Mexican tablets let's a good 12,000 years. This would mean there was writing in Mexico at a time in which, according to the general view of archaeologists, Texapan man, one of the earliest primitive American hunters, was pursuing his mammoths and would, as the anthropologist Robert Wauchope pithily put it, quote, have had some difficulty signing his name with an X, unquote. Little humor there. Churchward had heard of the existence of these tablets from a priest of the Indian monastery and had pleaded for 6 months before he was allowed to see them. The tablets had lain untouched in vaults since time immemorial. Of course, the clay tablets were written in a secret script, but fortunately the priest still had the key to it in his possession, and he taught Churchward what he knew. Quote, months of intense concentration in translating the tablets followed, but the reward justified the effort. The writings described in detail the creation of the earth and of man and the place where he first appeared. Mew! Exclamation point, unquote. Whatever details were lacking from these Indian tablets were supplemented by the Mexican text. This is a mere sample of the Mew theory. It is hard to say how many followers Churchward has today. There must be a great many of them. I personally have known only 2, both mystics devoted to the wisdom of the Orient. Not long ago, one of them sent a postcard to an Indian guru of his acquaintance asking whether he was doing right to sell his house. Anyone who is interested in Churchward's astonishingly detailed texts can easily obtain them. By 1961, the Lost Continent of Mew had reached its 20th edition. What is more, there is now a paperback edition as well. The fascination of these books for the layman is based on their seeming to solve innumerable problems that intrigue him but which he has never investigated in a serious way, so that he has no notion of the underlying elements and difficulties. These books, and this is the secret of their success, do not solve the problems by stripping away veils and seeking that clarity which is the scientist's aim. Instead, they festoon the problem with all sorts of romantic folderol, bathe the whole idea in a false dusk of mysticism, and pretend to sell the reader a key that will instantaneously make him one of the elite, a member of a group possessing special secrets, and by that fact alone, able to grasp all the hidden truths that the scientist working, quote, only, unquote, with his impoverished intellect cannot possibly understand. To be sure, no scientist can manage without emotions. Inspirations, glimmerings, blind gropings, trials and errors are essential features of history of scientific research. It should be evident that the true test of the archaeologist in particular is whether he can so animate his material by the power of his imagination that he can bring the past to life. Quote, imagination is the fire of discovery, unquote, the great British archaeologist Flinders Petrie has said. Nevertheless, we must remember that science must ultimately be conceived as a method that keeps imagination under control, that its touchstone is always a fact which can be verified, and although it works with hypotheses, it never tries to make thesis of them until proof is forthcoming. Naturally, this is the ideal, even Ceram is qualifying this. Science makes mistakes, of course. That is part of the human condition. Even scientific theories are historically conditioned and subject to revision, but the principle holds true, okay? And so here's an interesting thing, because Ceram, whose real name was Kurt W. Marek, was actually worked for the Nazis in the Ministry of Propaganda. So I think that's one of the reasons also why he's careful about stuff in this book. This principle involves the very opposite of that pseudoscience which is practiced by quote-unquote crackpots. Highly intelligent, often amazingly well-read and diligent in the pursuit of whatever will serve their cherished systems. Most of them are harmless enough, although on occasion they can do enormous damage, as the cases of Houston Stewart Chamberlain and Alfred Rosenberg demonstrate. The crackpot has an obsession. Rosenberg's obsession was peculiarly repulsive, a peculiarly repulsive one, and proved to be highly contagious. His book, The Myth of the 20th Century, laid the foundation for Nazi National Socialism. That guy Rosenberg was one of the chief proponents of, ethnic cleansing and, pure race and all that kind of stuff. So that's why Ceram is mentioning this guy, because he also was an Atlantis and Aryan race researcher. The Nazis were busy chasing this thing, and they put their own slant on it, which sort of soured the taste to a lot of people, even today, about, maybe, the origins of human beings, maybe an alternative history. But, the Nazis were very principled in sort of souring, this sort of research. So that's something to keep in mind, that the research has been soured. It's not that it's wrong or bad. Even as Ceram, like I'm saying, read between the lines with Ceram, he still says, look for Atlantis. He's not saying, go along with, Rosenberg here. He's just saying, the possibility exists. The anthropologist Robert Woshop has made a special study of the crackpots in American archaeology. He describes, for instance, their aggrieved attitude towards the professional scientist. Quote, one cannot help but see some regularity in these attitudes. The typical advocate of the wild theories of American Indian origins begins his book with the underdog appeal. He points out that he has been personally scorned, ridiculed, or at best snubbed by the professionals. Then he predicts that his writings will be in turn be ill-received or ignored, and he proceeds to attack the thick-headed bigotry of the men in universities and museums. Frequently, he implies that they are not only hopelessly conservative and jealous of any scholarly inroads by amateurs, but also that they are actually dishonest, and when confronted with conflicting evidence, they will suppress or, if necessary, destroy it. Still, though blasting the professionals as ignorant, incompetent, and unethical, the pseudoscientists almost invariably take pride in any real or, more often, fancied approval they obtain from these misguided fuddy-duddies. Okay, so here we have a new word. This amusing coinage is not yet widely known. Fuddy-duddy is a portmanteau word compounded of fuddy-duddy in familiar sense of ultra-conservative and the academic title PhD. Here's a quote by Gladwin, a guy I discussed before, a guy who came up with alternative theories. They do not sleep with their windows open for fear that a new idea might fly in, unquote, said Harold S. Gladwin, who gave the new word currency. Yet Gladwin was an amateur archaeologist who himself financed worthwhile excavations and has much to his credit. But since several of his theories were not fully accepted, he felt himself to be a crusader against the professionals, who he snipes at as hopeless fuddy-duddies. It is rather amusing to note that a fuddy-duddy in one field can be a crackpot in another. Thus, Leo Wiener, though a Harvard professor of Slavic and philologist who knew more than 50 languages, offered a theory on the African origins of the Central American cultures. His attitude was more aggrieved than Gladwin's. Quote, unquestionably, unquote, he wrote, quote, the archaeological dogs will continue to bay at the moon. Walshup concludes with his words to which we can fully subscribe. The amateurs will always hate fuddy-duddies, and the professionals will forever scorn the crackpots. So there you go. This is, I just wanted to read that out of the book here because I thought it was important. You couldn't get through a book like this on amateur archaeology and alternative anthropology without having a chapter on, Atlantis and Mu and all that kind of stuff. But as far as what, was said at the end there about, the crackpots and all that kind of stuff, I mean, yeah, it's easy to say all that stuff. And again, if Ceram had lived to today, he may have had a different opinion about what is going on. Of course, with all the new research that's gone on, again, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, mainstream academics swore up and down that they don't know civilization was here prior to 6,000 at the time that Göbekli Tepe was being built, according to mainstream academics in the past, that we were supposed to be cavemen. So they were wrong about that. They were wrong about Troy. They were wrong about these other things. So there's good reason to question all of this stuff. And let me just read to you this real quick from this book called Prof Scan, okay, by this author, forget his name here, but I had heard about it from somebody, and sounds like an interesting book. It's about higher education. Let's see here, I can't get it. Let's see, I can go down here, let me see. Charles J. Sykes is the name of the guy. So let me read to you too. His first part of this book called The Indictment. And you listen to this and you tell me if you agree with this or it strikes any chords with you. H.L. Mencken had a simple plan for reforming American higher education. He suggested that anyone who really wanted to improve the university should start by burning the buildings and hanging the professors. It's easy, of course, to dismiss Mencken's prescription as frivolous, lacking the ponderous gravity that afflicts debates about higher education. And surely the stringing up of a few professors of sociology, chemistry, and French, along with the stray expert in Chaucerian verse, is hardly a serious or humane reform program, entertaining as it might be for the undergraduates. But Mencken's plan did something the host of critics and would-be reformers before and after him have failed to do. It went directly to the rot at the heart of the university. In recent years, dozens of commissions, foundations, and freelance pathologists have conducted endless postmortems on higher education. The decline of humanities, the fragmentation of the curriculum, the pathetic state of teaching, and the boggling price tag on the university's tapestry of failure. And predictably, they have rounded up the usual suspects: the students themselves, television, the federal government, capitalism, public grade schools and high schools, teenage sex, German philosophers Nietzsche and Heidegger, and for good measure, the Walkman radio. So far, they have all missed the mark. Mencken, writing more than 80 years ago with his usual directness, identified the real villain of the piece, the American university professor. Mencken caught the flavor of the new academic when he wrote, quote, "The professor must be an obscurantist or he is nothing. He has a special unmatchable talent for dullness. His central aim is not to expose the truth clearly, but to exhibit his profundity. In brief, to stagger the sophomores and other professors." Unquote. With only minor updating, the modern professors would rather have root canal work than spend time with any undergraduates. Mencken's analysis remains on target. The professorate has multiplied in the years since Mencken's analysis, even behind his grimmest nightmares. The result is modern university distinguished by costs that are zooming out of control, curriculums that look like they were designed by a game show host, non-existent advising programs, lectures of droning, mind-numbing dullness, often to 1,000 or more semi-anonymous undergraduates herded into dilapidated, ill-lighted lecture halls, teaching assistants who can't speak understandable English, and the product of this all, a generation of expensively credentialed college graduates who might not be able to locate England on a map. In the midst of this wasteland stands the professor. Almost single-handedly, the professors, working steadily and systematically, have destroyed the university as a center of learning and have desolated higher education, which no longer is higher or much of an education. The story of the collapse of American higher education is the story of the rise of the professoriate. No understanding of the academic disease is possible without an understanding of the academic man. This strange mutation of 20th century academia, who has the pretensions of an ecclesiastic, the artfulness of a witch doctor, and the soul of a bureaucrat. His greatest triumph has been the creation of an academic culture that is one of society's most outrageous and elaborate frauds. It is replete with the pieties, arcane rituals, rites of passage, and dogmas of secular faith. It also has an intimidating, mysterious best described as prop speak, and a system of perks and privileges that will put the most hidebound bureaucrat to shame. Ultimately, the academic culture represents a sort of modern day alchemy in which mumbo jumbo is transformed into gold, or in this case, into research grants. Consulting contracts, sabbaticals, and inflated salaries. Sorry about that. Professors have convinced society that this culture is essential for higher learning and have thus been able to protect their own status and independence while cheating students, parents, taxpayers, and employers, and polluting the intellectual inheritance of societies. Over the last 50 years, this academic culture has secured professors almost ironclad job security and the freedom to do whatever they like, and they do it well or poorly, or to do nothing at all. A bill of indictment for the professors' crimes against higher education would be lengthy. Here is a partial one. They are overpaid, grotesquely underworked, and the architects of academia's vast empires of waste. They have abandoned their teaching responsibilities and their students. To the average undergraduate, the professorate is unapproachable, uncommunicative, and unavailable. In pursuit of their own interests, research, academic politicking, cushier grants, they have left the nation's students in the care of an ill-trained, ill-paid, and bitter academic underclass. They have distorted university curriculums to accommodate their own narrow and selfish interests rather than the interests of their students. They have created a culture in which bad teaching goes unnoticed and unsanctioned, and good teaching is penalized. They insist that their obligations to research justify their flight from the college classroom, despite the fact that fewer than 1 in 10 ever makes any significant contribution to their field. Too many, maybe even a vast majority, spend their time belaboring tiny slivers of knowledge, utterly without redeeming social value except as items on their resumes. They have cloaked their scholarship in stupefying, inscrutable jargon. This conceals the fact that much of what passes for research is trivial and inane. In tens of thousands of books and hundreds of thousands of journal articles, they have perverted the system of academic publishing into a scheme that serves only to advance academic careers and bloat libraries with masses of unread, unreadable, and worthless pablum. They have twisted the ideals of academic freedom into a system which they are accountable to no one, while they employ their own rigid methods of thought control to stamp out original thinkers and dissenters. In the liberal arts, the professor's obsession with trendy theory, which is financially rewarding, has transformed the humanities into models of inhumanity and literature departments into departments of illiteracy. In the social sciences, professors have created cults of pseudoscience packed with one critic calls, quote, sorcerers clad in the paraphernalia of science, woolly-minded lost souls yearning for gurus, more concerned with methodology and mindless quantification than with addressing any significant social questions. In the sciences, professors have mortgaged their nation's scientific future and its economic competitiveness to their own self-interest by ignoring undergraduates and an epidemic of academic fraud. In schools of education, their disdain for teaching and the arrogance with which they treat their students has turned the universities into the home office of educational mediocrity, poisoning the entire educational system from top to bottom. They have constructed machinery that so far has frustrated or sabotaged every effort at meaningful reform that